for, you little brat?
You're gonna pay for that.
Get him! Brat! You are powerless against him! Let's say goodbye to your human heartthrob! No! Baby!
The Little Mermaid was never really a story about a mermaid falling in love with a prince. That is the version of the story we remember because the romance is easy to see, easy to market, and easy to summarize. But underneath the songs, the castles, the underwater kingdom, and the happily ever after, Ariel's story has always been about something much more uncomfortable. What happens when the person who loves you most is also the person standing between you and the person you are becoming? Ariel looks toward the surface because she believes there is something waiting for her there. Something she cannot fully explain. Her father sees that same surface and sees danger. And suddenly, the ocean becomes more than a fantasy setting. It becomes the boundary between childhood and adulthood, between protection and independence, between the world you were given and the world you desperately want to understand. So when Ariel asks to see what is beyond the water, what is she actually running from? Is she escaping Triton? Is she escaping the limitations of her kingdom? Or is she simply trying to discover herself before somebody else decides who she is supposed to be? That question becomes even more interesting in the 2023 live-action remake, because Disney was not trying to invent Ariel for the first time. The story had already become one of the most recognizable animated films in popular culture. The songs were famous. The characters were famous. The images were famous. For millions of people, The Little Mermaid was already stored somewhere inside childhood memory, preserved through VHS tapes, DVDs, television reruns, toys, theme parks, merchandise, and endless repeat viewings. Disney therefore faced a strange creative problem. It could spend hundreds of millions of dollars rebuilding a world audiences already knew, but money could not automatically solve the real challenge. Making Ariel look real was a technical problem. Making her journey feel real was the artistic problem. And then there was Halle Bailey. Her casting transformed the remake into something larger than another exercise in nostalgia, before the movie had even reached theaters. The announcement immediately became part of a cultural conversation about representation, ownership, childhood icons, and who gets to inhabit familiar stories. Some of that discussion was thoughtful. Some of it became poisonous. And much of it threatened to overwhelm the movie itself. But the controversy is not the whole story. The 2023 Little Mermaid is simultaneously a nostalgia machine, a technological experiment, a modernization attempt, and a new interpretation of a character who has existed in the public imagination for decades. Sometimes those goals work together. Sometimes they fight each other. And that tension is what makes this remake worth examining. Because what happens when the world you desperately want to enter is not necessarily the world you actually belong in? And perhaps the most interesting question is not whether this remake needed to exist. It is whether it found a reason to exist. Section 1.2, Video Roadmap. To answer that, we have to go much deeper than a conventional recap. Yes, we are going to revisit Ariel's journey from the ocean to the surface, from her first fascination with human objects to her confrontation with Ursula, and her eventual transformation into someone capable of choosing her own future. But the real story begins underneath those plot points. We need to understand why Ariel wants the human world so badly, why Triton reacts to that desire with such overwhelming fear, and why their relationship is arguably more important to the movie than the romance itself. We need to look at Prince Eric too, because one of the remake's most noticeable changes is its attempt to make him something more than the handsome stranger Ariel falls for. His expanded story gives the romance a different structure, turning two people from different worlds into characters who recognize something of themselves in each other. Then there is Ursula, who becomes particularly interesting when we stop treating her as simply the villain standing between Ariel and happiness. Ursula understands vulnerability. She recognizes exactly what Ariel wants to hear, and she turns freedom into a transaction. Her bargain is not simply a magical obstacle. It is a warning about what happens when desperation makes somebody accept a deal before understanding its consequences. We will also examine the ocean and the surface as symbols, because the geography of The Little Mermaid is really a geography of identity. Water represents home, but it can also feel like confinement. Land represents possibility, but possibility can also contain danger. Ariel spends the entire story moving between those spaces, and every movement forces her to redefine what freedom actually means. And then there is the music. Alan Menken returns to the material that helped define the original film, while new songs attempt to expand the emotional territory. We will look at Part of Your World, Under the Sea, Kiss the Girl, and Poor Unfortunate Souls, not simply as beloved songs but as pieces of character psychology. We will also examine Wild Uncharted Waters, For the First Time, and The Scuttlebutt, asking whether the new material deepens the remake or occasionally makes a story that once moved with remarkable simplicity feel heavier than it needs to be. From there, we will move behind the camera and into the enormous technical experiment of creating a live-action underwater musical. We will examine the digital creatures, the environments, the visual effects, the challenges of photorealism, Rob Marshall's musical direction, and the strange problem at the center of the entire production. How do you make a world originally designed through exaggeration feel believable without stripping away the very expressiveness that made it magical? Finally, we will look at the film's reception, its commercial performance, its cultural impact, and the divide between critics and audiences. Why did some viewers see an emotionally successful modernization, while others saw an unnecessarily long remake weighed down by visual effects problems? And after all of that, we will return to the question that has been waiting underneath the entire film. Is Ariel trying to become part of another world? Or is she finally trying to become herself? Section 1.3, Audience Connection. If you grew up with The Little Mermaid, watching the 2023 version can feel less like seeing a new movie and more like opening a room inside your own memory. You may remember Ariel before you remember the plot. You remember the red hair, the purple seashells, Sebastian's frantic expressions, Flounder's nervous loyalty, Ursula's enormous silhouette, and the first time you heard those songs. Maybe the original lived on a VHS tape that was watched so often that the experience of watching it became almost automatic. Maybe you encountered it later through DVDs, Disney Channel broadcasts, theme parks, toys, costumes, or endless references to the songs. That is why Disney remakes are emotionally different from ordinary remakes. When another studio remakes an old movie, audiences can compare two pieces of cinema. When Disney remakes one of its animated classics, audiences are often comparing two versions of themselves. The child who watched Ariel dream about the surface does not necessarily see the same story as the adult watching it decades later. The child sees adventure. The adult may see a teenager desperate for independence. The child sees Triton as an angry father. The adult may recognize a parent whose fear has become controlling. The child sees Ursula as a monster. The adult may notice how frighteningly good she is at identifying someone else's insecurity. That creates an impossible expectation. Nostalgia tells us the new movie should make us feel exactly as we felt before. But criticism tells us that a remake must justify itself by giving us something new. Those demands pull in opposite directions. If the remake changes too much, audiences can feel that their childhood has been tampered with. If it changes too little, audiences can ask why they needed another version at all. And that is exactly where The Little Mermaid becomes fascinating. Because this movie is familiar enough that almost every major moment carries an echo of 1989, yet different enough that several relationships have been rebuilt underneath those familiar scenes. Eric receives more interiority. Triton's relationship with Ariel receives more emotional explanation. Ariel's curiosity is emphasized beyond romance. Even the loss of her voice becomes an opportunity to explore communication in a different way. So this film deserves to be judged twice. First, as a remake of one of Disney's most important animated films. And second, as a standalone fantasy musical that has to work even when the audience already knows where every major story beat is going. That distinction matters, because knowing the destination does not automatically make the journey meaningless. Sometimes the real question is not what happens next. It is why it happens differently this time. Part 2, Context Background. Section 2.1 Production Origins. By the time Disney seriously began developing a live-action version of The Little Mermaid, the studio had already spent years turning animated classics into new versions of themselves. The strategy made obvious commercial sense. Disney possessed stories that audiences already recognized, characters that already had enormous cultural value, and songs that had already survived multiple generations. Instead of asking audiences to become familiar with a completely new fantasy world, Disney could sell them a return ticket to somewhere they already loved. The Little Mermaid was almost an inevitable candidate. The 1989 film was not simply another successful Disney animation. It helped launch the period commonly remembered as the Disney Renaissance, when the studio rediscovered the power of combining traditional animation, theatrical musical storytelling, memorable characters, and songs capable of existing independently from the films that introduced them. Ariel became one of the central faces of that transformation. So the question was never whether The Little Mermaid had enough cultural value to justify a remake. It had more than enough. The question was what could possibly be added. Disney confirmed development of a live-action adaptation in 2016, and Rob Marshall eventually became associated with directing the project. His background was especially relevant because The Little Mermaid was not simply a fantasy film with songs placed inside it. It was a musical whose songs carry character development, emotional transitions, comedy, romance, and narrative information. Marshall understood musical storytelling as a filmmaking language. That mattered because the remake needed to preserve something much more complicated than plot. It needed to preserve rhythm. David Magee's screenplay therefore had to walk a narrow path. The basic story could not be radically reinvented without ceasing to be The Little Mermaid audiences remembered. Yet simply reproducing every moment of the 1989 film would make the new version feel like an expensive visual duplication. Alan Menken returned to the music, preserving the connection to the original, while Lin-Manuel Miranda became involved in creating new material. That combination also meant that the filmmakers were carrying a piece of Howard Ashman's legacy into an entirely different filmmaking era. Ashman's contribution to the original was not simply that he helped write memorable lyrics. His songs helped make the characters' internal lives audible. Ariel does not merely say that she wants another life. She sings it. Ursula does not simply explain manipulation. She performs it. Sebastian does not simply tell Ariel that her world has value. He turns that argument into musical spectacle. Preserving that legacy while changing the production language was therefore one of the remake's biggest responsibilities. Then came casting. Halle Bailey's selection as Ariel immediately became one of the most discussed decisions surrounding the film. Her casting was historically significant because it placed a black performer at the center of one of Disney's most recognizable fantasy properties. But the public response quickly became divided between people celebrating the representation and people objecting to a perceived departure from the animated character. The controversy was intensified by the fact that Ariel had become visually iconic. Audiences often confuse a character's identity with the design through which they first encountered that character. But adaptation has always involved interpretation. Ariel was originally a drawn figure created through a specific visual language. A live-action version could not simply become a human copy of an animated drawing. It needed a performer. Bailey's casting therefore represented more than a casting choice. It tested whether audiences believed a familiar character belonged to a single image, or to the emotional qualities underneath that image. Jonah Hauer-King was cast as Eric, Melissa McCarthy as Ursula, and Javier Bardem as Triton. The voice cast included Davy Diggs as Sebastian, Awkwafina as Scuttle, and Jacob Tremblay as Flounder. Together, the cast reflected another challenge of the remake. The movie needed human performances and digitally created characters to feel as though they occupied the same world. That problem became especially difficult underwater. Instead of simply filming actors swimming through physical water, the production had to construct a digital environment capable of looking believable, while still allowing performers to sing, act, move, and communicate clearly. The above-water world could use real locations and constructed environments, while the underwater kingdom required extensive visual effects. And then production faced another obstacle. COVID-19 disrupted the filmmaking process, contributing to delays and making an already complicated large-scale production even more difficult. A movie involving extensive crews, digital effects, international production logistics, underwater-inspired performance, and major studio resources suddenly had to exist within an industry struggling to function normally. By the time The Little Mermaid reached audiences, it had therefore become the product of several competing ambitions. Preserve a beloved musical, modernize its characters, build a convincing fantasy environment, introduce a new Ariel, honor the past, and prove that the story could survive another generation. Disney had already solved the basic story decades earlier. The real challenge was finding out whether the studio could make audiences believe it was worth telling again. Section 2.2. Pre-release landscape. The movie entered a cultural environment where Disney remakes were no longer treated as automatic events. Early live-action adaptations had demonstrated that nostalgia could be extraordinarily powerful. But with each new remake, audiences became more skeptical. Was Disney reinterpreting these stories? Or was it simply rebuilding familiar intellectual property in increasingly expensive formats? That question followed The Little Mermaid everywhere. The 1989 original had an unusually protected position in Disney history. It was not merely remembered fondly. It was foundational. Ariel was one of the company's most recognizable protagonists, and her image was connected to an entire generation's understanding of Disney princess storytelling. That meant the remake carried an enormous burden before anyone had evaluated its screenplay, performances, cinematography, or effects. Casting became the first major battlefield. Bailey's selection triggered widespread discussion about representation, racial identity, adaptation, and the ownership people feel over childhood characters. Some criticism involved genuine questions about adaptation and visual interpretation. Other reactions were openly racist. Those conversations became tangled together online, making it increasingly difficult to separate legitimate criticism of the film from hostility directed at the performer herself. That distinction is essential. A movie can have weak visual effects without its casting being responsible. A remake can be too long without the lead actress being the problem. A new song can fail without representation being the reason. And an audience can dislike an adaptation without needing to deny another audience the right to identify with it. But social media rarely rewards that kind of separation. The trailers intensified everything. Familiar songs immediately triggered nostalgia, while the underwater imagery became a target for visual effects scrutiny. Viewers debated whether the sea creatures looked convincing, whether the ocean appeared too dark, whether photorealism was compatible with Disney fantasy, and whether the remake was preserving or diminishing the expressive quality of animation. Then came the pressure surrounding the music. Part of Your World was always going to be a test. The song is so closely associated with Ariel that any new performance would inevitably be compared with the original. Bailey's vocal ability became central to the promotional conversation because the filmmakers had one enormous advantage. The performer could actually carry the emotional weight of the song. At the same time, the movie had to sell spectacle. Marketing emphasized Ariel, Ursula, the underwater world, and recognizable musical sequences. The challenge was to make audiences excited about something they already knew, while avoiding the impression that Disney was simply replaying the same film with more expensive cameras. And beneath all of that was one difficult technical question. Can an underwater musical look physically believable without becoming emotionally artificial? Animation has an advantage that live action does not. An animator can exaggerate movement, lighting, expression, color, and physics to communicate emotion. A mermaid can move through water in ways that are impossible, because the audience accepts the world immediately. Live action invites a different kind of scrutiny. If the water looks real, viewers begin asking how the creatures move through it. If the animals look realistic, viewers notice their anatomy. If the environment becomes too dark, the fantasy can lose visual clarity. The Little Mermaid was therefore entering theaters with two audiences already waiting for it. One wanted the childhood movie they remembered. The other wanted Disney to prove why the childhood movie needed to be remade. And the only way to satisfy either audience was to make the emotional experience stronger than the controversy surrounding it. Part 3 Story Recap. Section 3.1. Act 1 Setup. The story begins beneath the surface, in a world that is both beautiful and restrictive. Ariel is a young mermaid living in the kingdom ruled by her father, King Triton. To everyone around her, the ocean should be enough. It is her home, her culture, her family, and the place where she is supposed to belong. But Ariel has never been very good at accepting the limits of belonging. She is fascinated by humans. She collects their objects, studies the strange things that fall into the sea, and tries to understand the civilization that exists beyond the water. To Triton, that fascination is dangerous. His hatred and fear of humans are not presented as a casual disagreement. They come from trauma, loss, and a history Ariel does not fully understand. And that is what makes their conflict so emotionally complicated. Triton believes he is protecting Ariel. Ariel experiences that protection as a prison. The difference between those two interpretations drives almost everything that follows. When Ariel explores a shipwreck, she is not simply searching for a prince. She is searching for evidence that another world exists. Human objects become clues. A fork can become a mystery. A statue can become a window into another culture. A ship can become proof that the surface is not the terrifying abstraction her father describes. Then she encounters Prince Eric. The shipwreck sequence establishes him as more than a distant romantic fantasy. He is adventurous, curious, and drawn toward the wider world in much the same way Ariel is. When the ship encounters danger, Ariel eventually rescues him after he is thrown into the sea. The irony is immediate. Ariel is fascinated by humans. Eric is fascinated by the world beyond his own boundaries. Neither knows that the person who understands their curiosity most deeply is already standing on the opposite side of the divide. Ariel returns to the underwater kingdom, but her fascination only grows. Her private sanctuary, the grotto filled with human artifacts, becomes one of the most important spaces in the story because it externalizes something happening inside her. Every object represents a question she has not been allowed to ask. The grotto is not simply a collection. It is Ariel's identity. That becomes painfully clear when Triton discovers it. He sees the human objects and interprets them as evidence of disobedience. Ariel sees them as pieces of a world she desperately wants to understand. Their confrontation therefore becomes more than an argument about where Ariel is allowed to go. It becomes a collision between two definitions of love. Triton believes love means preventing Ariel from experiencing the danger that hurt him. Ariel believes love should include the freedom to discover life for herself. When Triton destroys the grotto, he is trying to destroy the danger. Instead, he destroys the place where Ariel feels most understood. That emotional devastation pushes Ariel toward the surface and toward the song that defines her. Part of Your World works because Ariel is not simply singing about a man. She is singing about possibility. She sees a world that she cannot enter and feels the painful distance between observing life and actually participating in it. The song is psychological exposition disguised as a dream. Ariel does not know exactly who she will become above the surface. She only knows she cannot remain exactly who she is below it. And when that longing collides with Triton's refusal to understand her, Ariel becomes vulnerable to someone who does understand what she wants. Unfortunately, Ursula understands it for all the wrong reasons. Section 3.2. Act 1 Continued, Call to Adventure. Ursula enters Ariel's story at precisely the moment Ariel is most emotionally exposed. That timing is what makes the bargain frightening. Ursula does not need to force Ariel into anything. She simply has to offer an answer to a problem Ariel already feels is unbearable. Triton will not let Ariel reach the human world. Ursula can. The price is Ariel's voice. On the surface, the deal seems simple. Ariel will receive human legs in 3 days on land. If she receives a true love's kiss within that time, the transformation can become permanent. If she fails, the bargain belongs to Ursula. But the most important part of the deal is not the deadline. It is the voice. Ariel's voice is one of the clearest symbols in the entire story because it represents more than the ability to speak. It is her self-expression. It is her musical identity. It is the means through which she can communicate what she wants. So Ursula does something cruelly intelligent. She offers Ariel the world she wants while taking away one of the tools she needs to navigate it. Ariel accepts. The transformation is exhilarating and terrifying. She becomes human, reaches the shore, and wakes in a world she has spent her entire life imagining. But the moment she arrives, the contradiction becomes obvious. She has gained physical freedom. She has lost verbal freedom. Eric eventually discovers Ariel, and Grimsby is understandably confused by the mysterious young woman who cannot explain where she came from. Ariel cannot simply tell Eric the truth. She cannot explain the underwater kingdom, the bargain, the deadline, or the danger. For the first time, she has entered the world she always wanted while lacking the language to describe herself inside it. That is the cruel brilliance of Ursula's bargain. Ariel thought the surface would solve her identity problem. Instead, it forces her to discover whether identity can survive without explanation. Triton eventually realizes what Ariel has done, and his fear becomes horror. But the more he tries to control the consequences, the more Ariel's decision becomes irreversible. Ursula now possesses a piece of Ariel's agency, and the bargain gives her leverage over both Ariel and Triton. Ariel's journey has crossed a threshold. Before this moment, she was an observer. Now she is a participant. She can no longer simply look at the human world from a distance and imagine what it might be. She has to live inside it, experience its confusion, and accept its consequences. That distinction is crucial because freedom in The Little Mermaid is never presented as the absence of consequences. Freedom means becoming responsible for choices you were once protected from making. Ariel has chosen the surface. Now she has to discover what that choice actually costs. Section 3.3. Act 2, a rising action. Life above the water begins almost like a dream. Ariel discovers the palace, the people around Eric, and the strange rhythms of human life. Everything she once studied as an outsider becomes something she can physically experience. But she still cannot speak. That limitation initially makes her seem vulnerable, yet it also forces Eric to notice her differently. He cannot simply be impressed by her voice or by the myths surrounding her. He has to observe her personality through movement, expression, curiosity, and action. And Eric has his own curiosity. The remake expands his character by giving him a stronger relationship with exploration. He is not simply a prince waiting for his life to begin. He has his own questions about the world and his own sense that the boundaries around him are not necessarily the boundaries he wants. That creates a more balanced relationship. Ariel is not simply attracted to the handsome prince. Eric is not simply attracted to the beautiful, mysterious girl. They recognize a shared hunger for experience. Wild Uncharted Waters makes that parallel explicit by giving Eric a musical expression of the fascination Ariel has already communicated through part of your world. For the first time, the romance begins to feel less like one character entering another character's story, and more like two characters discovering that they have been asking similar questions from opposite sides of the ocean. Meanwhile, Sebastian is desperately trying to help Ariel reach her deadline. His attempts to create romantic opportunities produce some of the film's lighter moments, while Scuttle and Flounder contribute their own forms of comic energy and emotional loyalty. Kiss the Girl becomes the obvious turning point. The entire sequence is built around the possibility that Ariel might actually succeed. The atmosphere becomes romantic, playful, and increasingly hopeful. After everything that has gone wrong, the story briefly feels as though it might resolve without another catastrophe. But Ursula is watching. That matters because the audience knows something Ariel does not. Her apparent success is happening inside a trap. The introduction of Vanessa turns that trap into a physical threat. Ursula takes Ariel's stolen voice and gives it another body, creating a version of the romance Ariel cannot control. The clock is ticking. Ariel has only a limited amount of time. Eric is becoming emotionally connected to her. Triton is becoming increasingly desperate. Ursula is becoming increasingly powerful. And for a brief moment, the story creates the illusion that Ariel has found the answer to everything. She has reached the human world. She has found someone who understands her. She may even be close to becoming part of that world permanently. But the closer she gets to the future she imagined, the more clearly the story reveals its central truth. Ariel cannot simply escape one form of control and call that freedom. She has to learn how to choose her own future. Section 3.4. Act 2B Midpoint Crisis. The apparent victory collapses when Ursula's plan finally takes control of the story. Vanessa arrives carrying Ariel's stolen voice, and Ariel recognizes the danger too late. This is where the loss of Ariel's voice becomes more than a magical inconvenience. It becomes the decisive weapon in a struggle over identity. Eric is enchanted by the voice he associates with the girl who rescued him. Ariel can see what is happening, but she cannot explain it. She is physically present while being narratively powerless. That distinction is devastating. She is there. She understands. She knows the truth. But she cannot make the truth heard. Triton attempts to intervene, yet his anger and desperation ultimately become part of Ursula's power. The contract is no longer an abstract promise. It becomes a mechanism capable of transferring Ariel's vulnerability into Triton's destruction. Triton sacrifices himself. Ursula gains control. And Ariel reaches the lowest point of her journey. The transformation is almost complete in the wrong direction. She escaped the ocean because she believed the surface represented freedom, only to discover that freedom without agency can become another prison. She has legs but no voice. She has proximity to Eric but no control over the story. She has escaped her father's kingdom but has fallen into Ursula's contract. The irony could not be clearer. The person Ariel feared would control her is no longer the only person controlling her. Ursula is. But this is also where Ariel begins to change. She does not simply remain helpless. The people around her become active participants in the struggle. Sebastian, Flounder, and Scuttle stop functioning merely as comic companions and become allies. Eric begins to uncover the truth for himself. That matters because the story distinguishes helplessness from passivity. Ariel cannot control every circumstance, but she can decide what she does next. The final movement therefore begins not because Ariel suddenly becomes all-powerful, but because she recovers something more important than power. She recovers determination. The girl who once looked toward the surface wondering whether another world existed now understands that another world is not automatically a better world. The challenge is not simply reaching it. The challenge is fighting for the right to choose what happens there. And that brings the story toward its final confrontation, where Ariel's journey stops being about escape and becomes a struggle for autonomy. Section 3.5. Act 3 Climax Resolution. Ursula's final transformation makes the conflict physically enormous. The villain who manipulated Ariel through contracts and psychological pressure becomes a gigantic force capable of dominating the ocean itself. The scale is spectacular, but the emotional meaning is simpler. Ariel is finally facing the person who turned her desire for freedom into a weapon against her. What makes the climax work is that Ariel is no longer simply waiting for someone else to rescue her. Eric becomes an active participant, and Ariel herself demonstrates tactical intelligence and courage. The famous ship sequence transforms the tools of the human world into weapons against Ursula, symbolically reversing the entire story. Humanity is no longer merely the forbidden world Ariel wanted to observe. It becomes part of the solution. Ursula is defeated. Triton is restored. And the father who spent the entire story trying to prevent Ariel from entering another world finally has to accept that his daughter cannot remain protected forever. Their reconciliation is therefore more meaningful than a simple apology. Triton does not merely forgive Ariel for disobeying him. He accepts her independence. Ariel, meanwhile, does not return to the ocean and pretend the conflict never happened. She becomes human permanently, entering the world she had spent so long imagining. But the ending does not need to declare one world superior to the other. The sea and land can now connect. Ariel does not have to erase her origins to build a new life. She does not have to reject her family to become independent. And Triton does not have to stop loving his daughter in order to let her go. That is why the ending is ultimately about reconciliation rather than rebellion. Ariel's goal was never simply to leave the ocean. Her real goal was to become someone who could choose where she belonged. The wedding therefore becomes the visible expression of a deeper transformation. Two worlds that once seemed mutually exclusive can now exist in relationship with each other. The ocean and the surface are no longer absolute opposites. And Ariel no longer needs permission to imagine another life. The question that began the story has finally changed. She is no longer asking, "Can I enter their world?" She is asking, "What kind of life do I want to build?" Part 4. Character Analysis. Section 4.1. Protagonist Deep Dive. Halle Bailey's Ariel is the emotional center of the remake because her performance understands something essential about the character. Curiosity is not the same thing as rebellion. Ariel does not want another world simply because she hates her own. She is fascinated by it because she does not believe that the boundaries around her should determine the boundaries of her imagination. That difference is important. If Ariel were simply rebellious, her conflict with Triton would be easy to understand. She would want to break rules because rules annoy her. But Ariel is more complicated. She is inquisitive, impulsive, emotionally open, and often reckless. Yet her central motivation is a desire to understand. Her surface goal is becoming part of the human world. Her internal goal is discovering who she is. That is why the grotto matters so much. It is the physical manifestation of an identity Ariel has been building privately. Every human object tells us that she has been thinking about this world long before Eric enters her life. The remake repeatedly emphasizes that distinction, allowing romance to become part of Ariel's journey without becoming the entire reason for it. Her voice is equally important. Ariel's singing voice is one of her most recognizable qualities, but the story turns that strength into vulnerability when she gives it away. Losing her voice means losing a literal form of expression, but it also forces her to discover that communication is larger than speech. Her body language becomes important. Her facial expressions become important. Her choices become important. Her willingness to act becomes important. In that sense, Ariel's silence becomes an unexpected part of her character development. She has spent the beginning of the movie wanting to be heard. Then she enters the human world unable to speak. The irony forces her to demonstrate that being heard and having a voice are not always the same thing. Bailey is especially effective because she does not need to make every emotion enormous. Her Ariel can be vulnerable without becoming weak and determined without becoming invulnerable. Her vocal performance provides the obvious musical power, but her quieter moments are equally important. There is an innocence in her curiosity. There is fear beneath her confidence. There is emotional pain beneath her rebellion, and there is growing self-awareness beneath her mistakes. That last point matters because Ariel should not be interpreted as perfectly independent. She makes dangerous choices. She accepts Ursula's bargain without fully understanding it. She trusts her own longing more than her father's warnings. She enters a world she does not understand. But becoming independent does not mean becoming incapable of making mistakes. It means learning from the consequences of those mistakes. By the climax, Ariel has changed from an impulsive teenager desperate to escape limitations into an active hero willing to fight for the future she has chosen. That transformation is why Bailey becomes the strongest argument for the remake's existence. The production can debate visual effects. The audience can debate whether every new song works. Critics can debate the runtime. But none of those debates change the fact that Bailey makes Ariel feel emotionally alive. And ultimately, that is the hardest thing for any remake to reproduce. Section 4.2. Antagonist Psychology. Ursula works because she understands Ariel before Ariel fully understands herself. That is what makes her dangerous. She does not approach Ariel with a threat. She approaches her with empathy. She recognizes the conflict with Triton. She recognizes Ariel's frustration. She recognizes the hunger behind part of your world. And then she offers herself as the person who finally understands. But Ursula's version of understanding is predatory. She listens for vulnerability because vulnerability gives her leverage. The contract is therefore the perfect weapon for her. It looks like freedom because Ariel is allowed to choose it. But the terms are designed so that Ariel cannot easily understand the true cost of the choice. Ursula does not sell Ariel freedom. She sells her a version of freedom with a hidden price. Poor Unfortunate Souls turns that manipulation into theatrical performance. Ursula uses humor, confidence, charm, and spectacle to disguise the danger underneath the deal. Her voice is literally powerful. Yet she is also obsessed with Ariel's voice because she understands how much identity can be contained within sound. That creates a fascinating parallel between Ursula and Ariel. Both want freedom. Both want power. Both understand performance. Both know that identity can be strategically presented. But they use those qualities in opposite ways. Ariel is trying to discover herself. Ursula is trying to control how other people see themselves. Ariel's freedom requires responsibility. Ursula's freedom is built on exploitation. Melissa McCarthy's performance leans into the theatricality of Ursula, while allowing moments of menace to exist underneath the comedy. That balance is important because Ursula has always been a larger-than-life character. Making her too realistic would destroy her function. Making her purely comedic would destroy her threat. Her connection to Triton also gives her ambition a personal dimension. She does not simply want Ariel's downfall. She wants power over the kingdom. But Ursula's psychological complexity has limits. She is compelling because of what she represents more than because the movie gives her an especially deep interior life. She is temptation. She is exploitation disguised as empathy. She is the person who tells you exactly what you want to hear because she knows that wanting something badly enough can make you stop reading the fine print. That is why she remains one of Disney's most effective villains. She does not need to convince Ariel that freedom is good. She only needs to convince Ariel that Ursula is the person who can provide it. Section 4.3. Supporting Cast Dynamics. Triton is arguably the most important supporting character, because Ariel's entire journey is shaped by his fear. As a king, he represents authority. As a father, he represents protection. As a grieving parent, he represents unresolved trauma. And as an authoritarian figure, he represents the danger of allowing fear to become a parenting philosophy. His hatred of humans is not presented as random, comes from pain. But the movie also makes clear that understandable fear can still produce harmful behavior. Triton loves Ariel. That is precisely why their conflict hurts. If he did not care about her, his restrictions would be easy to dismiss. But he cares so deeply that he cannot tolerate the possibility of losing her. His protection becomes control because he believes preventing Ariel from making dangerous choices is the same thing as keeping her safe. Ariel does not experience it that way. Eric provides a useful contrast. His expanded characterization gives him curiosity and loneliness of his own. He is not simply a romantic prize waiting for Ariel to win him. He has his own relationship with exploration, and that makes their connection more reciprocal. Sebastian functions as advisor, mediator, and comic relief. His attempts to protect Ariel often place him between her desires and Triton's authority. Flounder represents childhood loyalty, the friend who stays close even when Ariel's choices become increasingly dangerous. Scuttle provides energetic comic relief and exposition, while Grimsby represents the social expectations surrounding Eric. Queen Selena expands the human side of the story and helps give Eric a stronger family context. The ensemble therefore attempts to modernize the story without abandoning the personalities audiences remember. The challenge is tonal. Comedy can keep a fantasy musical lively, but too much comedy can weaken emotional tension. The remake sometimes has to move rapidly between grief, romance, spectacle, and jokes. Still, the strongest supporting relationship remains Ariel and Triton. Because Eric may be the person Ariel chooses to love, but Triton is the person she has to learn how to understand. And Triton, in turn, has to learn that loving his daughter does not give him ownership over her future. Part 5 Theme Symbolism. Section 5.1 Core Themes. At its heart, The Little Mermaid is a story about protection becoming control. Triton believes the safest future for Ariel is one in which she remains within the boundaries he understands. Ariel believes a meaningful life requires the freedom to encounter what lies beyond those boundaries. Neither position is completely absurd. That is what makes the conflict work. Parents are supposed to protect children. Children are eventually supposed to become independent. The problem begins when protection refuses to evolve. Ariel's curiosity represents the natural human desire to understand what exists beyond familiar boundaries. Her fascination with humans is therefore larger than the fantasy premise. It reflects a universal adolescent experience. The moment when the world inherited from your parents begins to feel too small. Eric represents a parallel version of that curiosity. He wants to explore because he believes the unknown may contain something valuable. Triton reacts in the opposite direction. He believes the unknown contains danger. The story therefore creates a conflict between curiosity and fear. That conflict also becomes a story about identity versus expectation. Ariel is born into a world with an obvious definition of who she is supposed to be. She is a mermaid. She is a princess. She is Triton's daughter. But none of those descriptions answer the question she keeps asking. Who am I beyond what everyone already knows about me? That is why communication becomes another central theme. Ariel's voice represents agency. When she loses it, she loses the easiest way to express her desires. Yet she continues communicating through action, expression, and choice. The film therefore suggests that identity cannot be reduced to a single ability or role. It also explores belonging versus assimilation. Ariel does not need to stop being a mermaid in order to value humans. She does not need to reject the ocean in order to love the surface. Her final future works because the two worlds can coexist. That is more meaningful than simply choosing one side. The romance is therefore only one part of Ariel's development. Romantic love matters, but self-discovery comes first. Eric does not create Ariel's desire for another world. He becomes part of a desire that already existed. The deeper question is uncomfortable but universal. How much freedom should someone receive before they are ready? The movie never gives a simple answer. Instead, it suggests that readiness itself can only develop through experience. Section 5.2 Visual Symbolism. The visual language of The Little Mermaid is built around division. Sea and land. Darkness and light. Confinement and openness. Home and unknown territory. Ariel's grotto sits at the center of these contradictions. It is hidden beneath the ocean, yet filled with objects from the surface. It is technically part of Ariel's home, but emotionally it represents her desire to leave. The water itself functions in two contradictory ways. It is home, and it is prison. That duality is essential. Ariel loves the ocean. She is not miserable every moment she spends there. But she cannot accept that loving her home should mean never exploring anything beyond it. The surface becomes a horizon, both literally and metaphorically. It is the place where Ariel can see possibility but cannot yet touch it. Her red hair functions as another element of visual identity. It immediately separates her from the environment around her and reinforces the idea that she is visually distinctive, even before she understands why she feels different. Ursula's darker palette creates a visual contrast with Ariel's openness. Triton's weapon represents authority and power, a physical object that reflects his position as ruler and father. The shipwreck becomes a symbolic bridge between worlds. It is where human and mermaid spaces physically intersect, and it is where Ariel first moves from observation into direct involvement. The shore becomes a liminal space. Ariel is neither fully mermaid nor fully human there. That makes it the perfect location for transformation. The remake's challenge is that animation could express these symbols with extraordinary flexibility. A drawn ocean can be saturated with impossible color. A character can move with exaggerated fluidity. A background can shift according to emotion. Photorealistic filmmaking imposes more physical limitations. Water has to look like water. Animals have to look like animals. Light has to behave like light. And yet fantasy requires exaggeration. That tension is visible throughout the film. Ursula's final size becomes especially important because scale transforms her from manipulator into environmental threat. The wedding, meanwhile, reverses the earlier divisions. Instead of separating worlds, the final imagery suggests connection. Boats become bridges. The shore becomes a meeting point. The ocean no longer has to represent a boundary. It can become a pathway. Section 5.3 Deeper Meanings. The most interesting layer of The Little Mermaid may be the way it handles inherited fear. Triton's fear of humans has been shaped by experience, but Ariel inherits the consequences of that fear without necessarily inheriting the reasons for it. That is how generational conflict works. Parents sometimes pass down conclusions without passing down the full story that created them. Children then challenge those conclusions because they experience the world differently. Ariel is not automatically correct about humans. Triton is not automatically correct about them either. The story becomes meaningful because curiosity forces both sides to confront assumptions they have treated as permanent truths. Ursula exploits that division. She understands that when people feel trapped between worlds, they become vulnerable to anyone offering an easy escape. The contract therefore represents exploitative freedom. Ariel is technically choosing, but choice without informed understanding can still become manipulation. That distinction makes the loss of her voice even more significant. When Ariel gives away her voice, she is surrendering agency in exchange for access. And the movie repeatedly demonstrates the cost. Silence does not make her powerless as a person, but it makes her easier for others to define. Her journey back toward agency therefore requires more than recovering her voice physically. She has to reclaim the right to decide. This creates a tension between destiny and choice. Ariel is born into one world. She discovers another. Ursula tries to determine her future. Triton tries to determine her future. Even the conventions of romance appear to determine her future. But the final resolution only works when Ariel becomes an active participant in deciding what her life should be. That is why the remake's expanded material can be understood as an attempt at psychological maturity. The 1989 story was already emotionally effective, but the 2023 version repeatedly emphasizes why its characters make the choices they make. Triton's fear receives more context. Eric receives more motivation. Ariel's curiosity becomes more explicit. The relationship between Ariel and Eric becomes more reciprocal. These changes do not fundamentally rewrite the fairy tale. They reinterpret its emotional logic for an audience accustomed to asking why characters behave the way they do. Part 6. Production Breakdown. Section 6.1. Animation Visual Effects. Turning an animated underwater fantasy into live action is almost a contradiction in itself. Underwater filmmaking is difficult even when the goal is realism. Add singing characters, digital creatures, mermaids, elaborate choreography, and a fantasy kingdom, and the technical challenge becomes enormous. The production therefore relied heavily on digital environments and visual effects to create the underwater world. That decision makes sense. Real water creates problems for lighting, sound, movement, hair, makeup, and performance. A performer cannot simply sing naturally while swimming through a physically realistic underwater environment. The production needed to simulate the conditions while retaining control over the performance. But simulation creates another problem. The more realistic the environment becomes, the more the audience expects the digital creatures to behave realistically too. Sebastian cannot simply look cute. He has to look like a crab. Flounder has to resemble a fish. Scuttle has to belong to the physical world. And yet all three have to perform musical comedy. That is an almost impossible balance. Animation solves this naturally because the audience accepts that these characters are designed for expression. A fish can have exaggerated eyes because the entire world is already operating under artistic rules. Photorealism creates stricter expectations. The same challenge appears in Ariel's hair and movement. Underwater physics are different from ordinary human movement, yet the character still has to look emotionally readable. Then there is lighting. The ocean is naturally darker and more visually complex than the bright, colorful underwater fantasy of traditional animation. If the remake makes the environment too realistic, the audience can lose visual information. If it brightens everything artificially, the realism begins to feel compromised. Under the Sea becomes the ultimate test because it requires dozens of digital creatures to create an energetic musical spectacle, while still looking like inhabitants of the same physical ecosystem. Part of Your World presents a different challenge. It is less about spectacle and more about performance. The environment has to disappear emotionally, so that Ariel's longing becomes the focus. Ursula's giant form introduces another problem: scale. The visual effects team has to make her feel physically enormous without losing the theatrical personality that defines the character. Above water, the production could rely more heavily on real locations and constructed environments, including work associated with Sardinia and other production spaces. These environments provided the physical texture that live action requires. The result is a fascinating mixture of techniques: real performers, constructed sets, digital environments, CGI creatures, simulated underwater movement. The question is whether realism actually improves the fantasy. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it simply makes the audience notice the machinery. And that may be the central visual tension of the entire remake. Section 6.2 Directorial Vision. Rob Marshall's background in musical filmmaking makes his approach to The Little Mermaid particularly understandable. The movie is built around performance. Songs are not interruptions. They are narrative events. Part of Your World must reveal Ariel. Under the Sea must transform the tone. Kiss the Girl must create romantic escalation. Poor Unfortunate Souls must reveal Ursula's manipulation. That means Marshall's task was not simply to stage large musical numbers. He had to make each number perform a different dramatic function. The camera therefore becomes part of the musical language. Movement has to communicate emotion. The underwater sequences have to feel expansive, while keeping the characters readable. The romance between Ariel and Eric has to develop through performance rather than exposition alone. This is one reason expanding Eric becomes important. A longer relationship requires more emotional material, and the remake attempts to provide that through shared interests and musical perspective. The same principle applies to Triton. His relationship with Ariel has to carry enough emotional weight that the final reconciliation feels earned. But this ambition creates a pacing problem. The 2023 film is substantially longer than the original, and additional material can be both a strength and a weakness. More characterization can deepen the story. It can also reduce the sense of momentum that made the animated version feel almost effortless. That tension is especially noticeable in a remake that has to preserve iconic sequences. The audience already knows the major beats. Therefore, every new scene must justify the time it takes. This is where the movie's direction becomes a balancing act between fidelity and reinvention. Marshall has to preserve the familiar musical language while adapting it to cinematography that feels physically grounded. He has to make digital creatures behave naturally while allowing them to participate in broad musical comedy. He has to create intimacy between actors in a fantasy environment. And he has to make a story audiences know feel alive again. The film succeeds most when the direction prioritizes performance over spectacle. It becomes less convincing when visual realism starts competing with expressive fantasy. That distinction ultimately becomes one of the central artistic questions of the remake. Does the movie want us to believe this world exists? Or does it want us to feel what it would be like to dream about it? The animated film could do both effortlessly. The live-action version has to fight to keep them connected. Part 7. Music Sound. Section 7.1. Musical Score Analysis. Alan Menken's return gives the remake one of its strongest emotional bridges to the original. There is something almost strange about hearing those melodies again in a different cinematic environment. The notes carry memory before the scene has even finished unfolding. That is the power of musical familiarity. Part of your world remains central because Ariel's melody has always functioned as the sound of longing. It does not simply tell us what she wants. It creates the emotional space in which that desire exists. Under the Sea performs the opposite function. Where Ariel's central song points outward, Sebastian's song pulls inward. It argues that the world Ariel already possesses has value. Kiss the Girl represents romantic possibility. Poor Unfortunate Souls represents temptation. These songs therefore form a musical map of the story. Ariel's music points toward identity. Sebastian's music points toward belonging. Eric's new material expands the romantic perspective. Ursula's music turns performance into manipulation. The orchestration naturally has to evolve for live action, but the melodies remain recognizable enough to activate nostalgia. That is one of the safest decisions the remake makes. Changing the songs radically would risk breaking the emotional connection to the original. Preserving them too mechanically could make the movie feel like a cover version. The new material attempts to occupy the space between those extremes. Lin-Manuel Miranda's involvement brings a different lyrical sensibility, especially in songs designed to give characters more interiority or comic energy. The success of that material varies depending on how naturally it integrates with Menken's established musical world. But the return of Menken's core musical identity matters, because these songs survived the remake for a simple reason. They were never really about mermaids. They were about longing, about temptation, about belonging, about the fear of choosing the wrong future. That is why the melodies can move from animation into live action without losing their emotional core. Section 7.2. Song Sound Design. Part of Your World is not merely the film's most famous song. It is Ariel's character manifesto. Everything that follows grows from the desire expressed inside it. Wild Uncharted Waters gives Eric a parallel perspective, allowing the romance to become a conversation between two people who both feel drawn toward the unknown. For the first time, attempts to capture Ariel's experience of human life from the inside. It gives the remake another opportunity to distinguish curiosity from simple romance. The scuttlebutt performs a completely different function. It is energetic exposition, designed to move information through comedy and rhythm. Under the Sea provides tonal release. Kiss the Girl creates romantic escalation. Poor Unfortunate Souls transforms manipulation into entertainment. This is why songs are so important to musical storytelling. They can communicate emotional information faster than ordinary dialogue, because characters are allowed to express feelings at a heightened level. Sound design becomes equally important once Ariel loses her voice. Silence suddenly matters. The absence of her singing voice is not simply an empty space in the soundtrack. It becomes part of the story. The ocean itself also requires sound. Water movement, ambient noise, the muffled qualities of an underwater environment.